Even now, we're getting into looking at the amygdala and the hippocampus, which you actually probably would have looked at in localization of function. So yeah, it's even interesting to form those connections there when you're thinking about, all right, so in localization of function, I learned that the amygdala, the hippocampus have these roles. And now that we're looking at memory and learning, we can actually be linking it even further and thinking about, so the amygdala, I know that, it's involved in emotional processing. So how does that relate to memory? So we've got our little flowchart here. So this is discussing the role of the amygdala and the hippocampus in memory. So adrenaline, which is one of our hormones, stimulates the release of noradrenaline, which is another hormone or neurotransmitter. And then noradrenaline, once it reaches the amygdala, it actually stimulates the amygdala, which attaches emotional significance to the memory. And then the amygdala signals the hippocampus to ensure long-term storage. So from this information, this little flowchart that we have here, we can see that there's adrenaline has a role in memory, noradrenaline has a role in memory, and we can see that the amygdala has a role in memory in attaching emotional significance to what we're remembering. And then the hippocampus is actually really implicated in long-term memory as well. So memory, there are two important brain areas. Obviously, there's a lot of significant ones, even like we were looking at with the amygdala and the hippocampus. But two of the big ones that we'll also be looking at are the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex, as well as the hippocampus. And yes, so those are the main ones we'll have a look at for now. So the cerebellum actually has an important role in memory, and it's primarily responsible for remembering how to perform a motor skill. So one thing that I always remember about the cerebellum is it's actually very implicated in balance and producing a smooth movement. So the cerebellum is actually implicated in forming and storing implicit or procedural memories. So it's really interesting. You can see we're starting to make the connections between our different learning goals. Because when we were looking at earlier our implicit procedural memories, I mentioned that, for example, like this guy is running or riding a bike. It's actually a memory of how to do something. And our cerebellum is actually implicated in those memories for how to perform that motor skill. So it's a procedural memory store, and each subsequent practice of the skill will help the person to add to their procedural knowledge of the task. So even like I was saying before about how I'm beginning to learn the ukulele, I'm still not quite getting there, but I am making progress. But the more and the more that I practice, the more I'm learning how to strum, the better I'm getting at changing my chords, and the more that I practice, I'm actually getting smoother and smoother at producing the motor skill, which is because my cerebellum, as part of my memory, is actually learning, oh, okay, so just the more practice I get, it's learning, okay, so this is how we strum. It's the same with when we think of a little kid riding a bike. When a little kid's riding a bike, it's actually a really big, daunting and challenging task. But when they actually get into it and they learn how to ride a bike, like thinking most of us are probably fairly competent at riding a bike because we've had so much practice. So the cerebellum actually activates the relevant neural systems to retrieve a procedural memory, which enables you to perform the task without actively thinking about it. So again, it's that implicit procedural memory that the cerebellum's involved in. All the things that you do every day without actively thinking about, like I was saying, mixing a cake or riding a bike or playing an instrument or even driving a car. Obviously, a car still requires active conscious awareness and memory because of the changing situations around us. But for example, learning to drive a manual car, learning to change a gear is a very cognitively draining and challenging task initially, but once you practice it and get more used to it, it's much easier to focus on the other surroundings around you, which is why it's so important to do your 100 hours, because while we're still learning how to drive, how to accelerate, how to brake, that's all very draining and very challenging at the start of learning to drive. But once our cerebellum gets the hang of how to do these things, it becomes much more implicit procedural memory. In contrast with our cerebral cortex, which we can see we've got our temporal lobe, our occipital lobe, our frontal lobe, and our parietal lobe, but which obviously all have various roles in our memory. But what I actually did want to focus on before we move on was actually our hippocampus. So the hippocampus actually has an important role in memory formation and storage as well. I have a few notes here about it. So the hippocampus is involved in establishing the background information or context of new memories, such as the location and the place of the memory. However, an important thing to notice is that while some storage occurs in the hippocampus, a lot of memories aren't permanently stored here. They're processed in the hippocampus, that meaning is given to them, but they're actually sent to other areas of the brain, like areas in our cerebral cortex, for example, for storage, because there's a lot of different areas in the brain that are implicated in storage. I'm sure your textbook would have, a really thorough interconnected list of that. So the hippocampus, unlike other structures in the brain, the cells of the hippocampus are actually able to reproduce, which is actually what enables new memories to be produced in the hippocampus, especially those explicit memories. So when we're learning new things, for example, again, I come back to my geography example. When we're learning new things, for example, about a country, those explicit facts that we're trying to learn, our hippocampus, because it has that ability to reproduce and create new cells, that's actually how we're able to learn explicit facts and memory, because our hippocampus has that ability. The hippocampus is also involved in the consolidation of memory, as well as some of the storage and a lot of that processing. So there's a whole lot more. It's also involved in linking emotion to memory, because it has those relations to the amygdala like we have here. But there's a lot more to the hippocampus beyond what we have time for today. So I'd really encourage you to in your own time and in your own study, and obviously in your class time as well, to really focus and learn as much as you can about the hippocampus, because it has a very complex interrelated role in memory, especially that processing of new explicit memories. So